Chapter 2 Virtual Host. The purpose to use virtual host is in the hope that it can function like a host with physical entity. A lot of applications are relying on the physical interface of hardware, for example, RS-232 serial port link, or Bluetooth, to function. However, our product here is only focusing on network application. It means the major application transactions are going through network. You might need to pay attention if your application is of this category. Conceptually, the virtual host we mean here is like a container for OS, operation system, software to function. From the OS point of view, the virtual host provides CPU, memory, storage space, network interface, and other types of peripherals for it to function well, just like a physical machine does. To distinguish the OS providing virtual hosts from the OS running on virtual hosts, we call the OS providing virtual host as host OS or host system or base platform or base OS, and the OS running on virtual host as guest OS or guest system. The term virtual host sometimes includes guest OS. But in this section, it only stands for the collection of those emulated hardware components. For a physical machine to install OS, it is usually loaded from the media like CD or DVD or from the network via TFTP. The virtual machine does not have those physical entities, but it needs to simulate the environment similar to that. To install OS into the virtual machine, you need to prepare the CD/DVD image of this OS, usually in ISO format. Once the CD/DVD image is placed on the proper place, the host OS can load it into the virtual machine. Before we use the virtual host, it is necessary to decide the emulated hardware spec, for example, the size of memory and storage space, how many CPUs can be used by the guest OS, or how many Ethernet interfaces that the virtual host should have. Some of the attributes must be decided correctly at the very first beginning, some of them can be changed later. For example, the size of the storage space can be changed at any time. However, once the OS is installed, resizing the storage space needs to repartition and format the hard drive from the guest OS. It is not like resizing the memory that the guest OS can utilize it immediately. Those issues need to be considered at first. The base platform can have multiple instances of virtual hosts running on T. If the total amount of memory allocated to the virtual hosts in operation is larger than the actual memory that the base platform can provide, then some of the virtual hosts might not be able to boot up or some of them might encounter memory exhausted problems. The hardware viewed from the guest OS in virtual host is all emulated by the base platform. Thus, if the complexity of emulated hardware is reduced, the burden of the base platform is reduced. In order to have better performance, the selected peripherals of the virtual host should just meet the requirements of the guest OS without overbooking. As mentioned earlier, the base platform is to facilitate the network arrangement of the virtual hosts. Each virtual host can have multiple Ethernet interfaces placed into different bridges, and each bridge belongs to different subnet. The role of each bridge is governed by the base platform. Each guest OS might have different usage on the Ethernet interface, For example, one uses DHCP client to fetch IP address whereas the other uses DHCP server to distribute IP addresses for its clients to use. In this case, it is necessary to note if there exist two DHCP servers on the same subnet, you should only allow one to avoid collision. If a bridge A is NATed by the other bridge B, the network traffic from the hosts connecting to bridge A to the hosts in bridge B will be NATed by using the IP address of bridge B as the source IP address in the IP header. Those constraints should be studied before deploying software packages in virtual hosts. Along with choosing the bridge to join, setting a network interface also needs to specify the emulated Ethernet card in virtual machine. And the guest OS should have the proper driver in order to use Ethernet. Providing high-precision clock sources in virtual hosts is stressful for base platform. However, clock timing source is related to how frequent the system should react to the system events. If you find a sluggish response from the guest OS, it might be something to do with the system clock timing source. Windows system usually use low-frequency clock so that it will not have clock source issue. On Linux-based system, if clock source issues are encountered, please switch to use KVM clock. For each virtual host, a TCP port is assigned so that you can connect the console of the virtual host by using VNC Viewer, or SPICE client. This network connection is also governed by the access policies of the base platform. You have to connect from the network where it allows to access the host. To use the web management interface, access via http://IP_address 8082/apps/ the account admin is with default password admin123. You might change the password later via the web management interface. Upload CD image illustration 18, uploading CD/DVD image for guest OS. In order to boot from CD/DVD drive to install OS into virtual host, you need to provide the file of the OS in ISO format and upload it via system host upload CD image. The size of each image should not be larger than half of the physical memory of the base platform. Otherwise, the loading of the image to the system will fail. In that case, you need to use SCP or the other methods to deliver the image to the destined folder, /home/kemu/ISO. Please note that SSHD shall be running if SCP is used from the remote host. And TCP port 22 shall be open to this remote host if it is accessing from the WAN side, the area we labeled as net in our firewall. Create an instance of virtual host. Illustration 19, screen snapshot. For creating an instance of virtual host. To create an instance of virtual host, it is necessary to specify host ID other than disk space, memory, bridge, S, to join, the Ethernet interface model, and the port for VNC connection. The host ID is for you to identify the virtual host on the base platform. It is nothing to do with the host name or any identifier used by the guest OS. The checkbox USB tablet is used to resolve the mouse pointer synchronization issue between VNC and the host you are using for connecting virtual host. If the guest OS is Windows system, you need to click this checkbox. By default, PS2 keyboard and mouse are provided. Some of the Spice clients can provide the voice from guest OS to client OS, the OS where you are running Spice client. If you need to use the scenario, you should properly choose audio device. On old operation systems, like Windows XP, it only can detect AC97 for audio and Realtek 8139 for Ethernet. However, on newer operation systems, like Windows 7, or Windows 10, AC97 cannot be used. It is necessary to use Intel HD audio along with the chipset H9. We cannot list all the possible conditions here and provide all the solutions. You should evaluate the proper emulated hardware before you install the desired OS you want. Once you finish it by clicking Add, the host ID will appear on the right side. If there is nothing to modify or fine-tune, you can just head to System Host Management to install CD/DVD image to the virtual host. Bridge assignment. Illustration 20, bridge assignment and Ethernet type of a virtual host. In this web page for admin, it lists the Ethernet interface, by its MAC address, and the associated bridge number. If the setting needs to be changed, type host ID and bridge number above, and press delete. And add by entering host ID, bridge number that the Ethernet interface tries to join, and Ethernet model, press add button. Change the setting of memory and tablet. Illustration 21, changing memory size and enabling USB tablet of VM. If the size of the memory needs to be changed, it can be reset here. If the USB tablet can be used if you find out that your mouse pointer is with synchronization problem between guest OS and client OS when using VNC viewer. As we mentioned earlier, PS2 mouse and keyboard are provided by default. If your guest OS support them, you should not choose others. However, some operation systems, for example, Mac OS X Mojave, does not support PS mouse and keyboard and USB tablet. In this case, we would suggest you select USB mouse and keyboard and use Spice client, like Virt Viewer or Remote Viewer. CPU and chipset. Illustration 22, changing number of CPUs and chipset. The chipset Intel PIIX is used by default while creating an instance of virtual host. The chipset Intel PIIX is mainly for PCI to ESA, PCI IDE functions, and audio device like AC97. An Intel H9 chipset is mainly for SATA, serial ATA. Thus, if you plan to emulate IDE hard drive, use PIIX, for SATA, use H9. Some of the old systems do not support SATA drive. In this case, you need to use PIIX. Usually we will use the same CPU model as the base OS has for the emulation on guest OS. In case some of the operation systems need to use specific CPU model and CPU flag, you might select them from this screen as well. Storage device setting. Illustration 23, extra storage device setting. The screen here may not appear in the standard distribution. It is used to provide program flash for loading customized BIOS and extra storage devices for specific application. The provided images shall be placed under /home/kemu/extra in order for showing up in the selection list. The base OS usually provides only one disk as storage device to guest OS. If we would like to provision extra storage device, S, those extra hard drives will be placed at HDB and HDD when using IDE bus. If H9 ACI, SATA, is used, the two extra hard drives will be placed with bus IDs in front of the disk that the virtual host originally has. The disk image shall be provided in CAU2 format. You might use the tool CAMU-IMG on other Linux system to convert the disk image from the other formats. USB redirection happens between guest OS and client OS while running Spice client on client OS. It does not allow you to use USB redirection at will. On guest OS, it needs to detect USB 2.0 devices provided by H9 USB controller, EHCI and UHCI, or USB 3.0 devices provided via NEC chipset. On client OS side, the USB device cannot be used by the client OS during USB redirection. Some Spice clients would ask you to install extra software package for USB redirection. For example, Remote Viewer needs to have USB DK for USB redirection to work on Windows environment. If the customized BIOS, or UEFI, image is provided on this screen, You can just boot it from host management screen without specifying any boot options. Host management illustration 24, host management of virtual machines. For the first time, to bring up the virtual host, it needs to boot from CD/DVD image in order to install OS to virtual host. You can click the box boot from CD/DVD, select CD/DVD file, and choose the corresponding virtual host. Then, press start. If the virtual host can be brought up successfully, it will have running next to its host ID. In some cases, the CD/DVD image is not provided with the boot function but with software packages loaded with it for software installation after OS installation. You might select CD/DVD image without asking to boot from CD/DVD in these cases. VNC Viewer can be used to access the console during the installation process. It depends on the guest OS to arrange the installation procedures. Once the process to install from CD/DVD is finished, you might stop the virtual host and bring it up again without booting from CD/DVD. Please note that you use the IP address, ES, and TCP port of the base platform on VNC Viewer, or SPICE client, to access the console of a virtual machine, not the IP address of the virtual host. The following is the screen snapshot of using VNC Viewer to access the console of a virtual host for Windows installation, illustration 25, screen snapshot for using VNC. If using UEFI to boot system is needed, you have to check the box boot via UEFI as well. Please note that the UEFI firmware provided is for 64-bit system. Thus, the UEFI executables on the corresponding media should be of 64-bit binaries as well. You can also use SPICE client to access the console of the virtual machine. SPICE client does not work as nimble as VNC client, but it allows the audio to be transmitted to the client side. You can use any base platform's IP address from SPICE or VNC client to access a virtual host. If the virtual host is ODed with Microsoft Windows, you can use its remote desktop service. To use Microsoft's remote desktop, you need to use the IP address of that virtual host directly, not the base platform's IP addresses.